It was supposed to be a simple Saturday morning. Birds chirping, Mark trimming the hedges, and his wife Sarah humming as she carried 2 plates of freshly baked muffins to their elderly neighbors across the street. That's when Karen from the HOA strutted across the lawn in her usual oversized sunglasses, clipboard in hand like it was a scepter. Her lips curled into that familiar smirk as she watched Sarah pass by. Without a hint of shame, she blurted, loud enough for the entire block to hear, "Your wife really ought to stay out of the way and let the real grown-ups handle things. Just a housewife, right?" Mark didn't say a word. He just stared at Karen, then slowly turned to his wife, who had stopped in her tracks. The calm in Sarah's expression was almost eerie. She offered Karen a polite nod, turned back around, and continued walking. What Karen didn't know was that she had just insulted a woman who had commanded a fleet during maritime anti-piracy operations, navigated war zones in classified missions, and coordinated multi-branch joint exercises for the U.S. Navy. And now, she was about to wage a war far closer to home. 3 days earlier, Sarah had returned from a 3-month consultancy deployment at the Pentagon, working on AI-assisted naval logistics. She chose not to wear her uniform in public to keep a low profile, preferring yoga pants and sweatshirts while on leave. To most of the neighborhood, she was just Mark's smiling wife who loved to bake and help with the garden. No one ever asked much about her work. Not because it was boring, but because Sarah had a particular way of blending in while being 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Karen, however, had always taken that as weakness. Karen's reign as HOA president had been tolerated for years, mainly because most residents avoided conflict. She nitpicked everything from grass length to porch lighting to Halloween decorations that lasted too long. But lately, she'd grown bolder. She started pushing new rules like limiting the number of vehicles per driveway and requiring board approval for backyard events. When people pushed back, she fined them. When they questioned her, she threatened legal action. And when Sarah returned, Karen found a new target. The morning of the muffins was just the first jab. 2 days later, Sarah organized a small block gathering at their home with some lemonade, snacks, and lawn chairs for the kid. It was nothing fancy, just neighbors catching up and sharing stories. Karen showed up 20 minutes in, not with a smile, but with a stack of paper and a whistle hanging from her neck like she was coaching a soccer game no one signed up for. She marched through the gathering, blowing her whistle and declaring, "This is an unauthorized event. You're in violation of HOA Code subsection 4B. No gathering shall exceed 6 participants without prior written approval from the board." The crowd fell silent. One kid started crying because he thought the party was getting shut down. Sarah stood up slowly, brushing off her pants, and walked over to Karen with a calm smile. "Would you like a muffin?" she asked, holding out a tray. Karen scoffed. "Don't be cute. Just because you bring snacks doesn't mean you can break the rules. Why don't you go back to Pinterest or whatever it is housewives do all day?" The air turned heavy. Some neighbors gasped. Others stared down at their shoes. But Sarah, still smiling, leaned in slightly and said, "Noted." Then she turned, picked up her folding chair, and walked back to her porch without saying another word. Mark knew what that smile meant. It wasn't surrender. It was strategy. That night, while Mark washed dishes, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and her Navy issue tablet beside her. She wasn't working on cookies or craft. She was drafting something labeled Operation Homefront. Mark peered over her shoulder and saw spreadsheets, legal statutes, and a structural diagram of the HOA's governance framework. She had already pulled the HOA bylaws, the county's housing regulations, and a record of every fine Karen had issued for the past 18 months. Most were illegal. Several were blatantly fraudulent. "You're going to war with the HOA?" Mark asked cautiously. Sarah didn't look up. "No," she said calmly. "I'm conducting a targeted operation with layered contingencies, command-level planning, and exit strategies. Also," she added, scrolling through an email thread, "I called in backup." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Backup?" She glanced at him and grinned. Reinforcements will arrive Friday. Until then, we observe and gather intel. By Friday, Karen was already escalating things. A notice had been taped to Sarah and Mark's door that morning. It claimed their mailbox color was not in compliance with the neighborhood palette. It was beige. Karen insisted it needed to be granite sandstone instead. At 3 p.m., as promised, backup arrived. Not in uniform, but you could tell these weren't your average neighbors. 2 men and a woman, tall, composed, and carrying minimal luggage. One wore aviators despite the cloudy sky. Another had a navy tattoo just visible on his wrist. Karen spotted them and immediately walked over with her clipboard. Visitors must sign in at the board office if staying longer than 48 hours, she barked. The tall woman turned and smiled. We're just here to support a friend. Karen squinted at her. Support her how? The woman leaned in and said softly, in any way she requires. Then she turned and walked toward the house. Karen stared after her for a moment before pulling out her phone. That evening, Mark and Sarah hosted a quiet dinner in the backyard with her guests. Inside the house, a GoPro camera Karen didn't know existed captured her trying to peek through the fence, mumbling something about investigating foreign agents. That footage would come in handy later. The real turning point came the next morning at the monthly HOA meeting. Held in the community clubhouse, it was usually a dull affair with low turnout. But this time, nearly 20 people showed up. Karen stood at the podium, radiating confidence. Before we begin, she announced, I have proposed a new rule. Any homeowner found to be running unsanctioned gatherings or housing multiple unrelated adults without prior board notice shall be fined. She gave a smug glance in Sarah's direction. That's when Sarah stood up from the back of the room. She walked to the front, opened her folder, and calmly addressed the room. Before you vote on that, you might want to know that the clause you're citing from the charter was dissolved in 2017 under state-level housing compliance update. This is the relevant statute. She handed a printed sheet to the members of the board. Then she pulled out her Navy ID and held it up. Also, for those of you wondering why I've remained quiet, allow me to clarify. I'm Commander Sarah Hastings, United States Navy Reserve, currently stationed under federal contract to the Pentagon for strategic operations and civilian military engagement planning. And I'm on leave. Which means I have nothing but time. The room went silent. Karen turned pale. One board member muttered, "Oh my God." Another whispered, "She's the one from that coastal base op last year." Mark watched as Sarah stepped back with poise and a slight smile. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Then, in a final twist of irony, the Navy guests seated quietly in the audience stood and applauded. The rest of the room followed. Karen's hands trembled as she dropped her clipboard. It wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was the beginning of a full-on operation. Karen had launched a war against someone she thought was just a housewife. She was about to learn what happens when you provoke a Navy commander with a spreadsheet, a network, and zero tolerance for injustice. The following morning began with a knock on the door so sharp it rattled the windows. Mark opened it to find a uniformed courier delivering a certified envelope from the HOA. Sarah already knew what it was. Karen had followed through on her bluff and issued 3 citations in one go. One was for an unauthorized gathering involving military personnel, the second for multiple guests exceeding HOA limits, and the third, absurdly, for projected noise levels not matching community tranquility standards. Sarah flipped through the papers without emotion, each one more ridiculous than the last. She wasn't surprised. This was exactly what she had predicted Karen would do. But what Karen hadn't anticipated was that Sarah was not just reacting. She was orchestrating. Over the next several days, Sarah slipped into full tactical mode, though on the surface she still wore joggers and handed out banana bread to neighbors like any stay-at-home mom. Every movement she made was calculated. Mark watched in silent admiration as his wife set up what she called the civilian version of a field command center in their guest bedroom. One wall was covered with HOA documents, printed screenshots of bylaws, and a grid showing patterns of fines issued over the last 3 years. Red lines connected questionable dates and signature mismatches. She had already begun analyzing Karen's behavior like an enemy commander would analyze the terrain before battle. She mapped out Karen's movements, her schedule, even the time she walked her dog. That level of detail would have scared most people, but for Sarah it was routine. That Thursday, she met with 3 key neighbors who had long been quietly frustrated with Karen's reign but feared retaliation. One was a retired public defender, the second was a software engineer, and the third was a widow whose backyard swing set had been forcibly removed by Karen's cronies under the guise of safety regulations. Sarah presented them with evidence of Karen's misuse of power, including illegal citation templates and surveillance screenshots showing her trespassing on private property to gather evidence for her claims. The group was stunned not just by the volume of proof, but the surgical precision with which Sarah had assembled it. They agreed to help build a coalition for a recall vote, but Sarah wasn't stopping there. This wasn't about simply removing Karen. This was about exposing every rot hidden beneath the surface of the HOA's authority. Friday brought another dramatic encounter. Karen showed up unannounced at Sarah's property with 2 men in tow, both wearing security badges that read HOA Safety Patrol. They looked like they had just walked out of a paintball match, complete with cargo pants and mirrored sunglasses. Karen declared they were conducting a safety inspection. Sarah, standing on the porch with a glass of iced tea in hand, didn't even flinch. She asked them politely for identification. When they couldn't produce official documentation or a warrant for entry, she stepped aside and let Mark speak. Mark, who had once worked a few years in law enforcement before switching to a career in risk management, asked them point-blank if they understood the legal definition of trespassing. Karen huffed and said the HOA was above such red tape. That was when Sarah pulled out her phone and began recording. She asked them to repeat that statement. Karen's 2 hired thugs shifted nervously. Realizing they were being filmed, they muttered excuses and retreated down the driveway. Karen stayed behind just long enough to hiss, "Your little power trip won't last." Sarah simply replied, "I'm not on a power trip. I'm on a fact-finding mission." Then she turned and walked inside. Inside the house, Sarah's friends from the Navy continued assisting in quiet but powerful ways. One of them had already discovered that the HOA's financial filings were riddled with errors. A significant percentage of resident fines had been deposited into a third-party account rather than the official HOA treasury. Another had traced the company responsible for Karen's beautification contracts to a landscaping firm owned by her cousin in another state. It was all unraveling faster than Karen could imagine. But Sarah wasn't just exposing corruption. She was planning Karen's total procedural defeat, one clause at a time. A week later, Sarah attended another HOA meeting, but this time she brought backup. Not in the form of military friends or allies, but document. Dozens of them. Signed affidavits from residents, printouts of video evidence, audio transcriptions of Karen's most incriminating statements, and a formal request for a full audit of HOA funds signed by over 60% of the community. When Karen saw the stack, her face drained of color. She tried to interrupt, claiming the meeting was for board members only, but Sarah calmly passed out printed copies to each attendee and stated that under the open meeting clause of their own HOA rules, all residents had the right to submit concerns and present grievances. She even had the exact page number highlighted. The room fell into silence as Sarah began listing violations out loud. Unauthorized fines, misappropriation of funds, harassment of residents, use of private contractors without disclosure, surveillance without consent. It was like watching a courtroom drama unfold live. Karen attempted to dismiss the documents as fake, but several neighbors chimed in that they had received similar treatment and were willing to testify if needed. A murmur spread through the room. For the first time in years, Karen was losing control. In the days that followed, Karen tried to regain her footing. She launched a smear campaign against Sarah using the HOA newsletter, calling her an unstable military wife pushing a personal vendetta. But the backlash was swift. A resident who worked as a journalist called out the slander and warned Karen publicly that if she continued down that path, defamation charges would follow. Sarah didn't even have to lift a finger. The neighborhood had seen enough to start pushing back on their own. Mark, meanwhile, had begun installing additional cameras around their property, not for protection but for full transparency. Everything was documented, every encounter filmed. It was no longer just a defensive strategy. It was a broadcast of truth. Word began to spread outside the neighborhood. A local council member heard about the internal HOA issues and offered to mediate. Sarah politely declined, stating that resolution would come through proper procedures and accountability. And she meant every word. Karen's next move was her most desperate yet. She called the county zoning office and falsely reported Sarah and Mark for operating an illegal boarding house, referencing the Navy guests as evidence. 2 days later, an inspector showed up unannounced. Sarah welcomed him in, handed over notarized documentation showing the visitors were temporary guests, and included a signed letter from the Homeowners Association itself, dated before Karen's presidency, affirming that no such restriction existed. She also gave the inspector a flash drive containing Karen's call, which had been recorded from her open voicemail message. The inspector left within minutes, shaking his head. Karen was now officially flagged for misuse of county resources. Later that night, Sarah sat on the back porch with Mark, sipping tea as the cicadas chirped in the trees. The tension that had weighed down the neighborhood for years was finally lifting. A few houses away, kids played outside past dusk for the first time in weeks. Neighbors waved without fear of being reported. And though the battle wasn't over, Sarah knew the tide had turned. Operation Homefront was no longer just a defense against Karen. It had become a movement, and the commander behind it wasn't done yet. Not until every neighbor felt safe in their own yard again. Not until power was returned to the people. The next week began like a calm before a calculated storm. Sarah had already moved past the data collection phase and was now running a full-scale counter-operation. While Karen walked around the neighborhood swinging her clipboard like a sword, unaware of the trap she was slowly stepping into, Sarah was back in the converted guest bedroom, which now looked like a cross between a legal office and a military command tent. She had converted Mark's old workbench into a filing station. One monitor displayed drone-like surveillance footage of Karen pacing around properties, while the second screen pulled up HOA financials, invoices, and fake vendor statements. On her desk were 3 piles of documents labeled audit, election, and code violations. The strategic layout wasn't just for convenience. It was how her mind worked. One plan for every possible countermeasure. One contingency for every Karen tantrum. By now, the neighborhood had begun to shift its tone. Several residents who had been scared to even speak Karen's name were now dropping off baked goods at Sarah's door as a thank you. A few even whispered stories of how Karen had fined them over imaginary complaints like unapproved shade trees or garden gnomes that allegedly distracted drivers. Sarah wrote each of these down, every petty abuse of power catalogued and ready to be used in what she now referred to as the recall package. But she wasn't rushing. She wanted Karen to feel safe. The more secure Karen felt, the bolder her mistakes would become. And that's exactly what happened. 3 days later, Karen sent out a community-wide email announcing a new HOA beautification rule that would fine residents $50 per week if their garbage cans were visible from the street. The email looked professional on the surface, but Sarah caught something in the footer. The rule was backdated to 3 weeks prior. That meant Karen had already started issuing fines before even notifying the neighborhood. Worse, the bank account number listed for the fines wasn't the official HOA account. It was a shell account under a different name. That was the moment Sarah knew she had her. She called a quiet meeting in her garage and invited 5 core neighbors she trusted, each representing a different section of the subdivision. As they sipped coffee and reviewed the evidence on folding chairs and patio cushions, Sarah laid out her next move. First would be a public HOA meeting, where she would request a vote for financial transparency and the introduction of an independent audit. Then, with majority signatures already secured, she would motion for a recall election. Karen, currently clinging to power with a falsely extended term and no formal re-election paperwork, would be legally forced to step down. But Sarah didn't want just a win. She wanted a clean, airtight victory, one Karen couldn't twist into martyrdom. The group agreed, and a date was set for the next HOA meeting. Meanwhile, Karen, oblivious to the growing mutiny, continued her delusions of grandeur. She began hosting her own exclusive brunches with hand-picked neighbors, mostly those who didn't attend meetings or cared little for neighborhood affairs. She passed out glossy flyers declaring her new initiative called Project Vision, promising a stricter, cleaner, more orderly neighborhood. But nobody asked for it. Nobody voted for it. It was another self-appointed title from someone who had long confused authority with ownership. The weekend before the vote, Sarah executed what she called the visibility phase. She printed copies of the bylaws, highlighted every infraction Karen had committed as HOA president, and hand-delivered them to every mailbox in the community with a personal note encouraging residents to attend the meeting. She kept the language respectful, never accusatory. She let the documents speak for themselves. By Sunday night, Karen was receiving calls from people who had never spoken up before. Several questioned her about the garbage fines. Others asked where the money was going. Karen, panicked, sent out an email calling the notes a smear campaign from someone trying to politicize the neighborhood. The irony of that statement didn't escape anyone. The night of the meeting arrived, and the clubhouse was more packed than it had been in years. People were standing in the hallway. Some brought chairs from home. Karen showed up late, visibly rattled, trying to appear composed. Her usual allies were scattered, nervous, unprepared. Sarah sat in the front row with Mark at her side, flanked by several key neighbors. A stack of documentation rested on her lap like a legal sledgehammer. When Karen opened the meeting with her typical welcome and rambling agenda about seasonal flowers and fence regulations, Sarah raised her hand. Karen ignored her. A second hand went up, then a third. When a fourth neighbor stood and said they wanted to hear what Commander Hastings had to say, Karen froze. Sarah walked to the front with the grace of a diplomat and the precision of a naval officer. She politely requested the floor, and was granted it by the senior board member, who looked as exhausted as everyone else. Sarah began with facts. No drama. No theatrics. Just a calm explanation of what had been discovered. Unauthorized fines. Unregistered account. Backdated rules. She showed screenshots of emails, footage from her security system, and copies of vendor transactions that didn't exist. Then she presented the signed audit request with over 70 names. The room erupted in gasps. Karen tried to interrupt, but by then it was too late. A neighbor shouted that they'd been fined $300 for a flower pot. Another woman accused Karen of threatening to tow her car for being in her own driveway. People who had been silent for years finally found their voices. Karen stood and screamed that this was a military coup. That the HOA wasn't the Navy and Sarah couldn't just take over. Sarah, unmoved, replied, "I'm not here to take over. I'm here to take back what belongs to this community. And I didn't bring weapons. I brought the truth." The audience clapped. The board, seeing the inevitable, voted unanimously in favor of an audit and agreed to initiate the recall vote effective immediately. Karen stormed out of the room, knocking over a chair as she passed. Her final words echoed behind her. "You'll all regret this." By the next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Peaceful. A kind of silence that only arrives after the tension break. Sarah had returned home, kicked off her shoes, and sat on the porch with her tablet. She checked her emails and saw several new messages from residents sharing their own stories and offering to volunteer. Mark brought out 2 mugs of coffee and joined her, watching the sunrise stretch across the now unified street. She didn't smile with smugness or victory. She smiled with relief. But she knew it wasn't over yet. Karen wouldn't go quietly. There was still the audit to finalize, the votes to secure, and the incoming drama Karen would undoubtedly try to stir up again. But Sarah was ready. Her plan was unfolding exactly as she had drawn it. And she had a secret weapon Karen would never see coming. Not muscle. Not intimidation. Just a calm, precise, strategic dismantling of everything Karen had built through fear. One document at a time. One truth at a time. The war wasn't over. But the battlefield was no longer Karen's. It belonged to the people now. And their new commander didn't need a rank to lead. She just needed a clipboard, a pen, and the will to do what no one else dared. The day the audit report landed in the neighborhood's email inboxes was the same day the community finally realized just how far Karen had gone. It was a detailed 50-page document compiled by a neutral third-party accounting firm, arranged with the precision only someone like Sarah could coordinate behind the scenes. Every page read like a financial horror novel. Funds earmarked for neighborhood maintenance had been redirected to a cleaning service that didn't exist. Vendor payments were made to a landscaping company owned by Karen's out-of-state cousin. Charges for imaginary beautification projects, inflated invoices, multiple personal reimbursements with no receipts, and worst of all, an entire year's worth of unaccounted fines listed under miscellaneous income. The total amount misappropriated was more than $37,000. The community was stunned. No one, not even the most skeptical neighbors, could have imagined the woman who obsessed over mailbox heights and lawn decor was casually stealing from all of them for years. Sarah had anticipated the uproar. In fact, she planned for it. She made sure the audit dropped just days before the recall election. That timing was no accident. It gave people time to process the betrayal but not enough time for Karen to mount a counterattack. As predicted, Karen didn't go silent. She stormed back into public view with fury. She printed her own flyers claiming the audit was fabricated and that Sarah had bribed the firm using her military connections. She even went door to door, waving around handwritten notes filled with vague legal threats and references to defamation laws she clearly didn't understand. But the damage was already done. Trust was broken, and her voice had lost its power. The neighbors no longer saw her as the enforcer of order. They saw her as a con artist in a polo shirt. Mark and Sarah kept their distance, knowing Karen was desperate and unpredictable. One evening, Karen came to their porch, uninvited, holding a thick stack of papers and demanding a debate. Sarah calmly told her that any and all communications moving forward should go through the HOA election committee and gently closed the door. Mark locked it without a word. The next day, Karen filed a cease and desist letter, claiming Sarah had orchestrated psychological warfare. The attorney who received it at City Hall laughed and forwarded it to the county clerk's office with a note that read, "This is what happens when HOA delusions go federal." The recall vote was scheduled for a Saturday at the clubhouse. By then, the community had turned the event into something much larger. Neighbors brought snacks. Kids rode around on bikes with signs that said "Take back the block." A few even wore homemade t-shirts with cartoon versions of Sarah's face drawn like a comic book hero. Sarah tried to stay humble, but Mark knew this meant something to her beyond just the neighborhood. For someone who had served her country in high-stakes missions across the globe, being able to protect her home, her actual home, was personal in a way nothing else had ever been. The vote turnout shattered records. Nearly every homeowner showed up. The process was quick. Ballots were dropped into a secured box, and the counting began shortly after. When the results were announced, 74 votes in favor of removing Karen, 6 against, and 2 abstained, the room erupted in cheers. Some people cried. A few high-fived like it was the Super Bowl. Karen wasn't present. She had sent a representative, a sour-looking man with a Bluetooth earpiece and a wrinkled dress shirt, who took the news, mumbled something into his phone, and left without saying a word. Later that evening, Karen released a poorly worded statement on the community Facebook page blaming cancel culture and military propaganda for her downfall. It was promptly flagged for misinformation and removed within the hour. With Karen officially removed, the board needed someone to serve as interim president until formal elections could be held. The room fell silent when Sarah's name was brought up. She stood, smiled, and politely declined. Instead, she nominated Mrs. Tandy, the retired high school teacher who had lived in the neighborhood since the beginning and was loved by everyone. The board approved her nomination unanimously. Sarah's refusal to take control made the victory even more complete. She hadn't done it for power. She had done it for peace. The days following Karen's removal were filled with a surreal sense of quiet joy. The streets looked brighter. People actually waved at each other again. The constant tension that had hung in the air like humidity was gone. Sarah spent her time helping reorganize the HOA's internal systems, creating templates that ensured future presidents couldn't manipulate the rules like Karen had. She even ran a free workshop at the community center explaining the legal limits of HOA authority and how homeowners could defend themselves. Attendance was so high they had to split it into 2 sessions. But Karen wasn't done just yet. In one final act of delusion, she filed a lawsuit against the HOA board and Sarah personally, accusing them of character assassination, emotional distress, and reputational damage. The judge dismissed the case within 10 minutes of opening arguments. Sarah didn't even need to testify. Karen had submitted her own fake documents, which contradicted the audited financials and her previous statements. The judge reportedly asked her if she understood what perjury meant and then advised her to seek actual legal counsel instead of watching courtroom dramas for inspiration. Following the court debacle, Karen vanished for a while. Rumors spread that she moved in with her sister across town or that she was staying with a cousin in another state. Some claimed to have seen her at the county library researching law books. Others said she was applying for a job at a craft store under an assumed name. Wherever she went, one thing was clear: she was no longer part of their lives. 1 week after the dust had fully settled, Sarah received a small envelope in the mail. No return address, just her name written in hurried cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the very first fine Karen had ever written to her. Dated from months ago, it cited Sarah for an unregistered potted plant. Below it was a single line scribbled in red ink that read, "I underestimated you." No signature. No apology. Sarah stared at it for a while, then handed it to Mark. He laughed and said it belonged in a frame next to her Navy commendations. They placed it in a small glass frame above the kitchen counter as a reminder. Not of victory, but of what happens when you let someone push too far, and the quiet ones finally stand. That night, the community gathered once more, not in protest or emergency but in celebration. The clubhouse lights glowed warmly. Kids ran through sprinklers. Neighbors shared food and drink. A jazz band played on a makeshift stage. At the center of it all was Sarah, not on a podium, not giving speeches, just talking with people, laughing, answering questions about gardening and storm drainage. When one teenager asked her if she had ever actually been in combat, she smiled and said the hardest battles aren't always fought with bullets. Sometimes they're fought with patience, preparation, and a very good folder of receipts. Mark watched her from the porch, holding 2 glasses of lemonade, one for him and one for her. As she walked toward him, waving to neighbors, he realized something. The woman everyone assumed was just a housewife had not only taken on a corrupt HOA president but also reignited a fractured community and taught them all how to stand up for themselves. And she had done it without ever raising her voice. The weeks that followed felt like spring arriving after a bitter winter. Without Karen's presence hovering over every decision, the neighborhood began to breathe again. Simple things like kids playing on sidewalks, porch lights staying on past 10, and backyard laughter no longer felt like acts of rebellion. Sarah walked the block every morning with a mug in hand, chatting with neighbors, offering advice on anything from home repairs to organizing legal files. To most of them, she wasn't just the woman who'd taken on the tyrant. She had become a symbol of something they'd almost forgotten existed in their neighborhood: quiet strength backed by competence, a leader who didn't need a title to command respect. But for Sarah, it wasn't about legacy or recognition. It was about returning things to their rightful balance and proving, mostly to herself, that she could protect her own slice of the world just as fiercely as she had protected national borders overseas. Mark could see the change too. His wife carried herself differently now, not in a way that made her appear above anyone, but in a way that spoke of peace finally earned. Her posture was more relaxed, her tone lighter. She even spent an entire Saturday repainting their fence, something she had talked about doing for 2 years but never had time for between deployments and briefings. Now she had time. Time that she wasn't spending fighting battles in foreign countries or quietly managing one on her doorstep. They had dinners on the porch again. Sometimes they sat in silence and watched the sky change colors. And other times they laughed about the absurdity of it all, how a woman with national security clearance had spent months dismantling a suburban dictator one spreadsheet at a time. But even as peace returned, small reminders of what had transpired still lingered. One morning, a delivery truck pulled up with a package addressed to Sarah with no sender. Inside was a framed caricature of Karen wearing a crown and sitting atop a stack of HOA fines. Below it, someone had written in block letters, "The Queen has been dethroned." There was no note, just the art. Sarah laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. She hung it in the garage next to the old war board that had mapped Karen's downfall. Not as a trophy but as a lesson, a reminder that abuse of power, no matter how petty or dressed up in fake authority, always had a shelf life. The biggest transformation came in the form of community engagement. Once Karen was gone, residents began participating in things they had long avoided. A monthly block cleanup resumed, this time with volunteers showing up early instead of avoiding it. A few families even started planting a community garden in the empty lot behind the clubhouse, an idea Karen had blocked repeatedly because she claimed it attracted bees. The new board, with Mrs. Tandy at the helm, operated transparently. Minutes were posted on time. Votes were held fairly. Rules were enforced gently and with proper discussion. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The neighborhood felt like a place where people belonged again, not where they merely endured. At a town meeting hosted by a neighboring community, Sarah was invited to speak about civic responsibility and how to hold HOAs accountable. She declined the formal title they tried to give her, insisting she wasn't a speaker, just a homeowner who got fed up. But when she stood before the audience and recounted what had happened, she didn't talk about Karen's madness or her own background. She talked about how fear had crept into every conversation in her neighborhood, how silence had replaced community, and how, sometimes, all it takes is one person to say enough. Her words hit harder than she expected. After the talk, several people approached her with stories of their own Karen-style dictators, some worse, some eerily similar. They asked her for advice. She handed out copies of the same bylaws Karen had once twisted and said, "Start with knowing your rights. The rest comes with courage." One afternoon, Mark returned home to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through old deployment journals. He asked her what she was looking for. She smiled and said she had written down a quote from a commander she once worked with, something about how the most dangerous opponents are the ones who underestimate you. She laughed and said she finally understood that on a whole new level. He watched her close the journal and tuck it away. That chapter was done. Not just the one in the neighborhood, but the one inside her where she had always separated her civilian life from her military self. For the first time in years, those two versions of Sarah felt fully connected. Complete. It wasn't long before news of her efforts spread further. A local magazine requested an interview, which she declined, only to have the reporter show up with a camera and a box of cookies from a neighbor. Sarah had helped get reimbursed for bogus fines. She reluctantly agreed, but only on the condition that the article focus on community action, not personal glory. When the story published, the title read, "Not Just a Housewife." It included a picture of Sarah in a hoodie, holding a rake in one hand and pointing to a broken sidewalk she was helping repair. The piece went viral locally. A few weeks later, a Navy veteran support group reached out and asked her to lead a panel on leadership outside the uniform. That she accepted. Then came the surprise. One bright Saturday morning, a Navy helicopter circled low over the nearby school field and landed gently on the grass. It was part of a youth outreach program organized by Sarah and a few active service friends to inspire local kids. Families poured into the field to tour the aircraft and meet real officers. Sarah stood off to the side in jeans and sneakers, chatting with parents, letting the focus stay on the kid. But Karen saw the chopper too. Unbeknownst to most, she had taken a part-time job at a supply warehouse nearby and was on her lunch break when the sound of the blades made her look up. She froze, her sandwich still halfway to her mouth. She turned and walked back into the warehouse without finishing her break. No one saw her again after that. That evening, Sarah received a plain envelope in the mail. Inside was another copy of the original fine for her potted plant violation. This one had been crossed out with a red marker. No return address, no message, no signature. Just a small checkmark drawn beside the words "voided by truth." She smiled, folded it carefully, and slid it into the frame next to the first one. Some victories come with fanfare. Others arrive silently, in envelopes with no names. As dusk settled, Sarah and Mark sat once again on their porch. The air was quiet, the street calm. Kids laughed in the distance. Porch lights flickered on, not as a warning to stay in line, but as gentle signs of life returning to normal. Sarah leaned back, sipping her tea, and whispered to Mark that the real battle had never been about Karen. It had been about reclaiming the soul of the place they called home. And somewhere between the audits, the spreadsheets, the quiet confrontations, and the recall votes, she had done just that. No uniform, no medals. Just patience, proof, and a firm sense of justice. A housewife, they said. But that was never all she was. She was a commander, a protector, a neighbor, and above all, someone who knew exactly when to fight, and how to win without ever raising her voice.